we started adding routes back in app.js, we were deciding whether to render main or sign in based not on the URL, but on whether you were signed in or not, right? So we don't want to see notes if you're not signed in. So we're no longer stopping that. If I sign out, well, the URL didn't change. I'm sure I signed out. I believe me. Let's look at app. App state UID is null. Yeah, we're not signed in anymore. But I can still go to /notes. I could go to sign in. That's fine. But I can also go to /notes and it doesn't stop me. I don't see any notes because I don't have a UID, and we're actually enforcing that at the database level, right? We're enforcing the privacy of our data at the database level, so we can't see anything, but this isn't the user experience we want. We don't want them to see a blank notes thing here. We want them to be redirected to the sign-in page, right? If they're not logged in. Similarly, if we are logged in, uh-oh. It happened. Yeah, cool. So here's a problem we have. Cannot read property ID of undefined. And if you look at where this is occurring, it's not showing us our code. It's actually showing us remove binding. There's an error in there that it's reading the property ID of undefined. Where have we seen that phrase remove binding before? It happened when we signed out. So after we sign out, we call base.removeBinding, right? And we pass in this.ref, and this.ref is the result of calling base sync state. So when we start syncing with Firebase, we save a reference to that so that we can stop syncing later. Now, right now, that's a problem because we're on this page despite already being signed out, right? And we just tried to sign out again, but we weren't signed in the first place. So this.ref doesn't hold anything anymore. We already cleared it out. So we're going to stop ourselves from even being able to see this page if we're not signed in. But we could go ahead and put a little safety in here. And don't do this unless this.ref is actually set. So we had, what do we call this? Sync notes. We could call it stop syncing. And what that's going to do, when we sign out, we call base.removeBinding. I'm going to cut that out of here and call this.stopSyncing. And inside this.stopSyncing, I'm going to first check if this.ref is even set. And if it is, then I'm going to remove that binding. Otherwise, we get an error in the internals of Rebase. Perhaps it ought to be checking whether that's null before it tries, but we can do it. So I extracted this out to its own method because now that I add that if statement, that just makes my sign out a little complicated. I don't want to put an if statement inside an arrow function. That's the callback to then following a promise. That's just a little too much. Plus, calling it this stop syncing, now I don't need a comment there anymore, do I? Instead, I've named my method in a way that sort of self-documents. It's very clear what this does. It stops syncing. Gosh darn it. So let's try this again. I'm not signed in. I click sign out. Okay, it doesn't explode anymore. All right, let's clear out my console. Yeah, it doesn't explode. That still doesn't get me back to the sign-in page. The point I wanted to make is if I am signed in, we've established that if I'm not signed in and I go to the notes page, I want to be redirected to the sign-in page. vice versa. Right now I am signed in, but I'm on the sign in page. If you visit the sign in page and you're already signed in most good apps, that'll just redirect you to, whatever the dashboard or home screen is of that app, right? If you go to twitter.com, I'm not saying twitter.com is a good app, but if you go there and you're already signed in, it'll show you your feed, right? I assume. So how can we do that? Before, down here in our JSX, we had a ternary, right? We can still do that. See how that would work. So let's deal with these one at a time. Okay, this is the route for if we visit /notes. If we are signed in, I want to show main. Otherwise, I want to redirect to sign in. So let's put a ternary in here. We can totally do that. What's the condition we want to check? This not signed in, right? That'll be true if we are signed in, false if we aren't. So we can basically say this dot signed in question mark. If it's true, yeah, main. If it's not, yeah, sign in, right? That's basically what we're doing. I'm going to put some line breaks and indentation in here a little differently to make this a little easier to read. So first of all, I'm going to indent all of this. And I'm going to go ahead and put the question mark on the next line so that it's clear that this is the positive condition of my ternary here. So this dot signed in, if that's true, do this. And the else would be a colon, right? Else what? I could just put the sign in component right here. But I want the URL to change too. I want it to actually change from /notes to /signin. Because I never want you to visit /notes, have that stay in the URL, and you see something other than notes. I want it to redirect. So we've already used redirect. Let's do it again. Redirect to /signin. Then it'll re-render. It'll match this path instead, this route, and it'll render the sign-in component. Get it? So if we match the route /notes, we'll call this render function, which has a ternary in it, which is just an if-else. If you are signed in, main. If you're not signed in, redirect to sign in. See if it works. Right now, I think we said we were signed in. Let's go to /notes. Nope, no, I'm not signed in. So it kicked me right back to sign in. If I click sign in with Google, and then I visit /notes. Nope, something's not working quite right. Here's my app component. My UID's there. What's the problem? This dot signed in ought to just return this dot state.uid. And if it's there, that should be true, and it should have rendered main. But it didn't. It redirected. Not only do I see the sign-in page still, it actually changed the URL. It redirected. So what happened? When does the UID get set? If I actually hit refresh, I start out running the constructor, right? And the constructor sets UID to null. And component will mount. It starts listening for the auth state to change. And when that happens, I'll call auth handler. So once Firebase has figured out, yeah, I'm already signed in, then it'll call auth handler, and auth handler will set the UID on state. But that's asynchronous. right? This is only going to run after Firebase has communicated with the server and determined that we are in fact signed in. Meanwhile, it'll go ahead and render the page. So when it first runs render down here and it hits this switch, it's going to match notes. It's going to see we're not signed in yet. The UID hasn't been set on state here. We have a race condition. So if we got our state set real fast, if Firebase were just lickety-split, then maybe that would happen before we got to this check. But that's not what's happening. It's checking it before the UID is set and redirecting us to sign in. Wah, wah. And then it's too late. What can we do? Here's one idea. What if we save the UID in local storage as well? And we load that up before it ever has a chance to render. Then it'll have us behaving as signed in, and then it'll still do the Firebase thing in the background. We won't really be syncing with Firebase until that's finished. Let's try it. So when would we do that? Auth handler is what sets it on state, right? So we ought to be able to do it at that point. Oh man, I heard some heavy sighs. This is complicated. I won't pretend otherwise. So before we set state, I'll go ahead and save it to local storage. Local storage dot set item. UID is the item. And I want to pass in user.id, yeah, user.uid, right? User.uid. Okay, so now we're storing it there as soon as auth handler gets called, which is anytime it recognizes that we have changed auth states and we do have a user. So that'll be set in local storage. So then when we first load this component, it'll run component will mount, which again runs before the DOM is rendered, right? Render hasn't happened yet. And right now it's doing this, but that's asynchronous. That'll happen in the background. It won't stop render from running. But we could go ahead and call, load it from local storage. So here's what I want to do. I need it to also set that on state at that point. I can't wait for on-auth state change to happen. I need it to happen before the page even renders. So I'm going to write a method for this. I'll put it right under here, called getUser from local storage. So then we'll get the UID, const UID equals local storage dot get item UID. If not UID, return. Just get the heck out of here. Otherwise, this dot set state, and its UID I want to set right to our UID variable, and since the variable name happens to match the key in the object, I can use the shorthand UID inside curly braces. So when the page first loads, we'll do this. We'll call this up here in component will mount, this dot get user from local storage. And this is synchronous, so it will wait until this happens, although set state is not. Set state can be asynchronous. Might still be kind of getting lucky. But let's see what that does for us. So that way the state will have the UID right away. So when it calls render and it does this check, we'll be signed in as far as it's concerned because all it does is check that there's a UID in state, right? Firebase won't have done its thing. We're not going to see any notes because we don't actually start binding with Firebase until we get that far. So let's try this again. Right now, I am signed in. So if I go to /notes, I want to stay there, not get redirected out. Yay, now it works. And if I click log out, it redirects me. We didn't have to do anything to say, when you click sign out, log out. We say when you click sign out, remove the UID from state. And that's a change to state, which results in calling render again. And so then when it runs this route, the next time, this.signedIn will be false, and it'll redirect. So not only will I get to the sign in component, the URL will change as well. So try to go to notes now when not signed in, and it redirects you to sign in. Pretty nice. So now we just need to do the reverse when you visit sign in. When you visit sign in when you are signed in, we want to redirect you to notes. It doesn't make any sense to visit the login page when you're already logged in, right? So we can just use the same trick again. Route path equals sign in, and then instead of component equals sign in, we'll add a render function or a render function, either way. We can again check to see if you're signed in. If you are signed in, then we'll redirect to, this time, /notes. If you're not, then we just render sign in. Now the truth is this path is saying you're not allowed to see this unless you're not signed in. So we might want to change the condition to check the opposite. As a general rule, you don't want to check negative conditions if you have an else. You don't want to say, if not this, do this else. Not else. You have to kind of jump through some Boolean hoops with your brain to figure out the double negative. But in this case, it might actually be preferable to say not signed in as a condition, because the positive step, you are allowed to see the sign-in page, happens actually on the negative check there. So if you're not signed in, show sign in, otherwise redirect to notes. Up to you. You can do it either way. I like using the negative condition here, I think. If you really hated the double negative, you could also make another function called signed out, but that is just the opposite of signed in. That seems kind of silly. Does it work? Let's sign in. And then let's try to visit the sign-in page. Hooray! I end up at notes. If I sign out, hooray! I end up at sign-in. I can no longer view /notes if I'm signed out, and I can no longer view /sign-in if I'm signed in already. That is a better user experience, I would say. Pretty cool. So what are we doing? Yeah, redirect based on authentication status. Anybody know the distinction between authentication and authorization? Anybody ever heard those described as two different things? Yeah.
Authorization, you're allowed to see it. The other one is, are they logged in?
Basically, yeah. So authentication is just verifying that you are who you say you are. It's just verifying your identity. Authorization is saying what you're actually allowed to do. So if you're saying, nope, you can't see these notes, that's not authentication, that's authorization. That's an authorization issue. Now you hear them kind of combined as this one big thing, auth, that kind of covers both. That's why people say auth sometimes, because they think of them together much of the time. If you look at, and I'll go to the afternoon here. Firebase, notice authentication has all this sign-in stuff, but the actual authorization stuff is not even in the authentication section. It's under database rules, right? This is the which data are you allowed to see based on who you are. Yep. Authentication, you are who you say you are. Authorization, based on who you say you are, here's what you're allowed to do.